You're watching act.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano. Our next guest is presidential candidate, that's right, presidential candidate Joe Kishore. He's running with the Socialist Equality Party using a strategy of World Socialist Revolution that is not national, but international, because what happens in the United States impacts people across the globe. That kind of goes without saying, but I said it. He's here with us now for more about his campaign and what it means for the fight for social equality against capitalism. Joe, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
It is very wonderful to have you. Joe, you have been the national secretary for the SEP since 2008 and an active socialist in socialist politics from 1999. He is a regular writer for World Socialist Web Site, where you go to get all the good stuff. So I'm sure there's going to be comments and questions coming in from Facebook and from our Twitch stream chat. Please mark your comments and question with the word question, and we will ask him as we move on. For those of us who are hearing about the Socialist Equality Party for the first time, can you give us an overview of what the party is and why you're running a candidate in the presidential election here in the U.S.?
Yes, well, the Socialist Equality Party is the U.S. section of an international movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International. We publish the World Socialist Web Site, as you mentioned, wsos.org. Our aim is to build a socialist movement in the working class in the United States and around the world. As you say, we're oriented towards the development of an international movement, that all problems are fundamentally international in character. I think certainly if one considers the coronavirus pandemic, it presents itself immediately as a global question, which requires a global solution. But we insist that the solution is socialism, that the fundamental disease is capitalism, is a society in which the forces of the economy, the gigantic corporations and banks are owned privately and run on the basis of profit and exploitation of the vast majority of the world's population, and that the solution is to establish a socialist society on a world scale, which is a society based upon social need, not private profit, the democratic control of the economy, global, rational, scientific planning to meet the needs of humanity.
Do you think that would shock Americans? I mean, I don't think Americans are ready for rationalism. We've been pushed off into irrational territory. We'd need a news network to be rational, I think. Like they have a news network to be irrational.
Well, I would say
getting off the topic here, but
that network is the World Socialist Web Site. I do think that the population is moving to the left. There's great interest in socialism, hostility to capitalism and inequality. One saw it, I think, in the widespread support for the campaign of Bernie Sanders, although Sanders' role was to channel that back behind the Democratic Party and now the Biden campaign. But the population is moving to the left. And
I think people do criticize him for that. I've heard criticisms of Bernie for that. But, my understanding is he's just so terrified of another Trump victory that he believes that supporting a third party candidate would just hand, the election to Donald Trump. Your thoughts about that?
Well, it's an argument that's raised every election, that the only way to defeat the far right is to support the Democrats. I mean, I've been in politics for 20 odd years, and it comes up in every election, and it's came up many times before then. But it all resolves into not building a political alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties, the two parties of the ruling class. And the result of it is always a further shift to the right. I think there's a number of points which really have to be stressed in relationship to sort of the lesser of two evils argument, which is always raised. One is that, if you want to take the question of Trump, he didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like he's some sort of aberration. He's the product of capitalism. And capitalism is supported by both these parties. It was, in fact, the right-wing policies of the Obama administration, the Clinton campaign that created the conditions for Trump's victory. And then, of course, you have to deal with what the politics of the Democratic Party is. It supports the interests of Wall Street. It supports war. It's trying to run its whole campaign now on the basis of anti-Russia and militarism. Biden is the personification of that. He's a personification of the Democratic Party as a party of Wall Street and the military and the intelligence agencies. And it always just forestalls the development of a real political alternative to the whole capitalist system. And I think
well, I think we should develop something and then step over it, right? Which is seems like what you're doing, as opposed to jumping off into I don't know. I don't want to hit a bottom with another 4 years of Trump. We don't really have a lot of time to figure this out, given the global the global environmental catastrophe that we are facing at this moment. It's hard. I see the argument that you're making, but it's hard. It's hard to envision not voting for Biden and voting for another candidate such as yourself. So you're without it just handing the vote to Trump. It's hard for me to envision that. I understand there are big problems with the Democratic Party. We do have people trying to work inside of the Democratic Party, AOC, Bernie, as you mentioned. Why is it important to get that third party in there instead of transforming the party we have from the inside out?
Well, I would say because that party can't be transformed. Parties represent class interests, and the Democratic Party is a party of the ruling class. But I think I would just make our orientation is to the development of the class struggle, the intervention, the interference of the masses, the working class, young people in the United States and around the world into the process of history and politics. And that's already begun to happen. I mean, last year, even before the pandemic emerged, you had the eruption of global protests throughout the world. Now, over the past 6 months, you had the very significant demonstrations against police violence and a growing social anger in the working class over the homicidal policy of the ruling elite in relationship to the pandemic. I mean, we are now in a situation where we have now 3 million cases. 133,000 people have died in the United States already. The death toll by the end of the summer will be above 200,000. I mean, this is a massive catastrophe, and there's immense anger in the working class.
I just heard that the Trump administration's policy is just to let the numbers go up so that people get immune to caring about the large figure, to just not make a big deal about the enormous amount of people who are dying, so that people are just become callous to it. I think he doesn't recognize that we're not going to become callous to it.
No, not at all. I mean, we referred to this earlier as a policy of normalizing death. We call it malign neglect. That is, that workers are just supposed to accept that they face the possibility of getting ill, dying, that their parents, that their children, that death will become a normal part of life. And for the ruling class, that's fine, because if workers die, well, someone else will replace them. But I think workers will have their own say in this policy. But it's definite. The so-called herd immunity, that's the policy they've now adopted. Just let it rip. Let the virus spread. I would say, though, it's not just Trump. I mean, Trump represents definite class interests. I mean, he speaks for the financial oligarchy. They handed themselves trillions of dollars in March with the support of the Democratic Party. And now they are insisting that workers go back to work in order to pay for it. There'll be no retreat from this policy.
Okay. So I have a question coming in from the chat, and it overlaps with a question that I have as well. Many of us have been watching the Democratic Socialist Party of America. What is the difference between the SEP, the party that you're with, and the DSA? Is there overlap?
No, the DSA is a faction of the Democratic Party. Its political function is to, I would argue, provide a left cover for the right-wing policies of the Democratic Party. In particular, that's been Sanders' role. And of course, the DSA promoted Sanders as the way forward. He was going to carry out the political revolution. Our movement argued that from the beginning, Sanders was not a real alternative. And this happened in 2016 as well. He tapped into immense social anger. And what was the product of that? It was only to direct it behind Hillary Clinton, the hated candidate of Wall Street and the military. And that actually created the conditions for Trump's victory. Now in 2020, he's performed a similar function. And he dropped out of the race at the very point that the coronavirus was spreading, that reality was demonstrating the necessity for socialism, for the overthrow of capitalism. And his response was to say, everyone go support Biden. And people hate Biden justifiably because of his record on everything: bank bailouts, the war in Iraq, the Glass-Steagall Act, increasing the powers of the state, mass incarceration. Biden is associated with that. And Bernie Sanders comes out and says, well, you have to support Biden in order to defeat Trump. And it's all within the framework of but the DSA, they serve to promote that politics, and Ocasio-Cortez as well. She's played that role in Congress, worked closely with Nancy Pelosi, in fact, and it serves to provide a left cover, the fiction that the Democratic Party is somehow going to be transformed, and it's not. It's a party that represents definite class interests. So we have very, very deep political differences with the DSA and other organizations, Socialist Alternative and similar groups that I would argue play the same political function.
And another question along the same lines, the differences and similarities between the Socialist Equality Party, where you're running, what you're running from your party, and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or the simply named the Socialist Party.
Well, when you deal with any of these parties, you have to examine their political history and their program. There are political differences. If you take the question of the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, it's a Stalinist organization, a nationalist party. That's its political roots. Our movement, the Socialist Equality Party, our traditions are Trotskyism, which is the fight for, we were discussing earlier, international socialist revolution. There are profound historical questions. In terms of the Socialist Party, I guess the Socialist Party USA is the reference. They're deeply embedded in the Green Party. The Green Party, actually candidate Howie Hawkins, or presumptive candidate Howie Hawkins, is a member of the Socialist Party USA. Mm-hmm. The Green Party serves as something of a sort of left auxiliary for the Democratic Party. It's always has. It's also a capitalist party. If you actually listen to what Hawkins says, he always says, well, the purpose of the Green Party is to elect Democrats. And whenever the Green Party is on the ballot, the Democrats do better. That's how he pitches his argument. They supported the Sanders campaign as well. So there are profound political differences between different groups that call themselves socialists. I would say that for those who are becoming interested in socialism, it's really necessary to study the politics and history of these organizations and our organization, which you can read about more on the World Socialist website.
So you are running for president of the United States. What would the response to all we have several globally, we have several crises happen here in the United States. We have the crisis of militarization of the police and all the attendant issues, both contributing to and springing from that. We have the coronavirus public health crisis. And we have an environmental crisis that touches all aspects of our lives. What is the platform? What would be the sort of policies that we would see coming out of your administration?
Well, I would say that all of these questions fundamentally are class questions and are rooted in capitalism. If you take the question of police violence,
I grew up here. My brain is it needs you to tell me.
Well, I think that these are questions of capitalism, and police violence is the product of the violence of the state, of the ruling class. Environmental degradation is the product of subordination of questions of the environment to profit. So we're fighting to build a socialist movement and create a socialist society. We advance definite policies. There has to be a massive increase in taxes on the wealthy. A wealth tax, the nationalization or the transformation of the major corporations into public utilities run on the basis of social need, the expropriation of the wealth that has been really stolen by the corporate and financial oligarchy, we call for a reversal of the trillions of dollars in bailouts. So these are policies that we fight for. But I would just say that, it's not just a question of what I would do if I was elected, because let's be honest, I'm not going to be elected president of the United States. The whole process is incredibly undemocratic. Our orientation is towards the development of a social movement in the working class. So the working class has to enter into struggle, has to fight for these policies, has to engage in strikes and protests and develop a revolutionary movement in the broad mass of the population to take power itself. The working class has to implement these measures. It's not going to be something which is done by this or that politician. We will fight for these, and if I was elected, I would fight for these policies as a president, or if we were elected in other positions, we would do the same thing. But the basic question is the development of a movement in the working class. And I think that in a sense, that's the difference between us and all other political tendencies. We're oriented towards that social force, which is completely excluded from political life, which has no representation in the official political system. And that force is increasingly angry. It's sickened by the policy of the financial oligarchy. It wants to fight for its rights and its interests, and that's the social force that we are oriented towards mobilizing. And we're using the election campaign as a mechanism to fight for that.
That's excellent. How maybe this is a question that's off topic here, but how is it that the force is, that a lot of working people voted for sort of the quintessential capitalist oppressor? Can you explain that to me, please? I mean, I've been collecting opinions, and people love to blame it on Hillary Clinton, but Hillary could have also been a capitalist oppressor, but she wasn't this guy. The guy we have, Trump. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think a lot of blame has to be on the Democratic Party and the character, and providing the opportunity for Trump to posture. And, he spoke about jobs and this sort of thing and was trying to make an appeal. I think it's worth, though, recalling that these were the two most hated candidates in the history of the United States for president, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
I wonder if they had run just Bill Clinton again instead of Hillary Clinton, because I do think there is a woman hating aspect to this.
I think that, a lot of the people who voted for Trump, who sort of switched over, voted for Obama before that. I mean,
He's not a woman.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I know, but the question of, because it's blamed on the bigotry of the working class, they're racist or they're misogynist, etc. And I think that's false. I mean, I think it's a product of the right wing character of the Democratic Party, sure, and Trump's posturing, etc. But again, I think that it's important that both these parties are hated. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are hated, and it's also a product of the fact that there is no genuine alternative. There's no way in which the working class can actually, through the electoral system, through the Democrats and the Republicans, actually express its interests. And that produces this. But I think, the more fundamental factor in what produced Trump is capitalism. He's really the product of the financial oligarchy. He's the vomiting up of decades of endless war, of torture, of social inequality, of Wall Street speculation. He's the product of this financial oligarchy. And that's
the cat hairball of financial oligarchy, as you put it. I like vomiting up. That's a great way to. Yeah.
That's a phrase taken from Trotsky. It refers to fascism, the vomiting up of all that is reactionary in capitalism. And Trump is certainly a fascistic personality. And you listen to his speeches on the 4th of July, and this is he's a would-be Mussolini. Trump. But he comes out of a social system. He's not an interloper in a Garden of Eden of American democracy, as if everything was wonderful before Trump came along and screwed everything up. He rather is the symptom of the deeper disease.
Well, one of the things I think is actually quite useful that under a Trump administration that would not have happened under a Hillary administration, and arguably would not have happened under a Sanders administration if Sanders had been, allowed to run and win in the 4 years ago, is the fact that now Americans are starting to wake up in a certain way to the injustice that is at our feet. It took a global pandemic. It took an economic crash. It took, hundreds of thousands of people across the country protesting the killing of innocent Black people. Or, it seems like there could be some good, if the moral arc toward a workers' revolution, it's not going to happen in one candidacy. It seems like we are on the arc toward getting there.
Well, yeah, I think that there is a broad political radicalization, and certainly the character of the Trump government has produced opposition, and is sort of stimulating social anger. People hate this president. I don't think that things would be fundamental. People would go through a different set of experiences if Clinton had been elected. I mean, we might be at war with Russia if Clinton had been elected. Certainly, she was really campaigning on escalating the war in the Middle East. That's what the military wanted. And the whole framework of the conflict within the state over the past 3.5 years has been centered on issues of foreign policy and the demand that the United States has to have a more aggressive line against Russia. I don't think there would have been certain differences if Clinton had been elected, but people would have gone through, I think, similar experiences about the consequences of capitalism, the nature of the rule of the financial oligarchy. It just would have been Clinton in power instead of Trump. So I think that what's really politically radicalizing people is the reality of capitalism, and that is producing enormous wellspring of social anger, which has to find a different political expression, not within the framework of these two parties.
In your campaign video, you talk about the international aspect of your campaign. How are you incorporating a global perspective in this national race? And how are you asking people without voting rights in the US to participate?
Well, as I said, the main purpose of our campaign is to build a socialist movement in the working class. That is our orientation, and that's an international question. We have parties throughout the world, socialist equality parties, which are developing that perspective in the different countries. Before the pandemic hit, of course, the plan was that we would go on tours. My running mate, Nerissa Santa Cruz, and I would go on tours throughout the world to explain what was happening in the United States. Of course, we can't really do that, but anymore because of the pandemic. But our orientation on social media, on the World Socialist Web Site every day, and the political analysis that we develop is towards the unification of workers throughout the world, in the United States, in Canada, Latin America, in Europe. I mean, in Africa and Asia. Really, workers in every country face the similar questions. Their exploitation is a product of capitalism. They face the consequences of this pandemic. They face the consequences of endless war, of the subordination of everything to the interests of the financial oligarchy. So these are international questions, and we call on workers all over the world to support the campaign. Of course, you can't vote for it, but the way to support is really to participate in this fight, to join the Socialist Equality Party, to join our sister parties throughout the world, and to really carry out and participate in this struggle.
We're speaking with Joe Kishore, Socialist Equality Party candidate for president. Joe, I appreciate you being here with us today. You say in your campaign video that the SEP does not focus on identity politics at all. How do you think that will come across to American progressives, many of whom are focused on racial justice, specifically identity politics? You can't get away from it at all in this country.
Well, we insist that the basic conflict is not racial conflict as is presented by the Democratic Party and the media, or in a different way by Trump. But the basic question is class conflict. And if you take it, I mentioned the question of police violence, and we've been speaking a bit about it. Of course, there is racism in police, and that the most backward and fascistic forces are promoted within the apparatus of the state. Trump certainly seeks to cultivate that. But police violence is fundamentally a class issue, as is poverty, as is unemployment. Everything, if you read the New York Times, you would get the impression that every significant social problem is simply a question of racial conflict, of racial divisions. And they talk about white supremacy and white privilege, etc. When the fact of the matter is that the interests of black workers and white workers, immigrant workers, are fundamentally the same. On the question of police violence, yes, it disproportionately impacts African Americans, but the majority or the plurality of people killed by police are white. So this is a problem and the police are an instrument not of racial rule, of white control. They're an instrument of class rule. Their aim is to defend wealth of the financial oligarchy. What unites all victims of police violence is that they are poor, that they are working class. And it's similar, it's a similar question with other issues. So we don't deny the existence of racism, but this effort by the Democratic Party to turn everything into a question of racial division and to present the white working class as somehow reactionary, somehow privileged, it is a barrier to the development of a genuine progressive movement in the working class.
I wonder which way it goes, though. I wonder if it's coming from the top down or the bottom up. I mean, it was the grassroots who took Bernie Sanders, the closest thing we have to anything socialist at all here in the United States, which you have already commented on his faults, and they attacked him for not being good enough on racial issues, for not calling racial issues to the table, for not being a class reductionist is what they called it, right? So how are we going to convince people to drop their own identities, what they really identify with, to identify in solidarity with other people in their class?
Well, I would first say that I think it is driven from the top. And there are definite political forces that really promote racial division. I refer to the New York Times just because it's really the main media outlet for the Democratic Party, but they are relentlessly campaigning on this question, including through a campaign to falsify and revise American history, which we could perhaps talk about, the so-called 1619 project. But I think among workers, this isn't what dominates. I mean, you go to work to speak to workers, and of course we do this in our campaign and every day in the World Socialist website. You often hear things like, the only color that matters to the corporations is green. It's not black or white. And you look at work stoppages, the auto plants. That's not white workers or black workers stopping production over the coronavirus. It's white and black workers, men and women. There is a profound class sentiment in the working class. I think that the racial politics and politics of racial division is very much pushed by layers of the upper middle class, including in academia, where this type of politics is universal or nearly universal, and it becomes an instrument on the one hand for fighting out positions within the state and within corporations. The aim of equity, not equality, but equity, is somehow that that the solution is simply to make sure that there's an equal number of women and minorities in the corporate boardrooms, as if this solves the problems of the vast majority of workers of all races. But I think this is very much pushed by layers of the upper middle class. The aim is to advance, as I said, interest within the top 10%, as well as, I think, to divide the working class. It's a very conscious strategy from the ruling class itself. They are terrified of the growth of a united movement in the working class. We've begun to see that. The protests over police violence themselves were interracial, multi-ethnic, international. Workers and youth of all races were involved. And so this effort to sort of create a racial conflict, I think, is very, very reactionary and counter to what is really required to fight against the social ills that face the working class as a whole. But I think that sentiment exists in the working class. I don't think it's the case that somehow workers are dominated by racial questions.
Well, we're speaking with Joe Kishore. We're actually out of time, and I do appreciate this wide-ranging discussion. Sorry about that last minute, me looking at the technology. Just wanted to make sure I covered all the questions and the comments and all the stuff that was coming in. So thank you so much for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
I was happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
If you're watching on Facebook, don't forget to watch our show every day except for Friday. Friday, we have a different show. So thanks for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel. I'm Julianna Forlano, and I am signing off from Facebook and from YouTube at this moment. I'll be over on Twitch for the next little while. So if you want more of this, come over to twitch.tv/act.tv. Thank you so much.